Um, Matt, once can you hit the, I'm gonna hit record. You hit the let people in button.
Okay.
I'm in LA right now, and it's like an unusual LA day because it has a little bit of rain in the air. So I feel
Oh,
like you being, and maybe you me a little bit of your Portland into my Los Angeles today, Melissa.
although
This is,
I was telling Matt, like it is a beautiful, sunny, cold. I mean, it's like, high 20s, but it's beautiful and sunny in Portland today.
oh, we'll take that.
It's like
How
this,
did that
we're having
happen?
this like amazing winter that's except for the skiers and the water supply later in the year. But like it's been very dry and sunny and cold. Like I'm flashing back to
Gosh.
being in Chicago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that cold. You're coming up here tonight, right? To the restaurant tonight. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I'm
did the drive
looking
this
forward
morning, and
to it.
it was 2 hours and 15 minutes this morning because of the stupid rain. So it's find the
Oh, I
right
was
window.
telling my
Don't get
friend
stuck in the
Krista to
traffic.
come tonight. I was telling my friend
Oh
Krista
yeah,
to come tonight. I wonder if she did. I have to ping her
I could
next
follow up
time,
with her.
probably.
Yeah.
Well, it's just another
Okay,
perfect
I'm
day.
gonna go ahead, Matt. Sorry,
It's just another perfect day in Sydney.
whatever. It's like summer in Sydney. That's fine.
Thanks for rubbing it in.
I was gonna say fact. Yeah, summer in Sydney right now.
I'm gonna kick us off here for a minute. Hey everyone, welcome to this Wednesday, February 12th. Oh my gosh, 2 days to Valentine's Day. I hope you guys bought all the chocolate boxes you need to before the time is
My
up
husband,
because
it's
it's
my
coming
husband's
coming
birthday.
soon.
That's what it is. That's in my house. It's
Oh,
just
really?
Paul's birthday. Yeah, it's Paul's birthday.
That's what it's known as.
What it's known as.
I'm going
It's
to
what I'm
add some
married into.
spotlights to the three of us here.
Oh, good. Then I can
Um,
really see the bad hair day.
yeah, exactly. I know this is like so mean, right? It's almost like you're better off than not looking yourself in the camera the whole time.
Yeah.
Um,
Turn my camera
it's so
off.
great to have you guys here. The weekly briefing. I want to introduce you to someone very, very special to me, my friend Melissa. Melissa, I swear, like the day we met, we became best friends. It was such a easy kickoff, and it was a client of mine that kind of had met you and said you two would get
Hmm.
along famously. So
Hmm.
um, probably the reason why we get along is we're somewhat of like I'll call it a geekiness or nerdiness about why people make certain decisions. And there's a
Hmm.
part of us, if you and I admit it out loud, like we get a little bit cranky on people when you and I kind of go back and forth on a call. We're like, why this, whatever. But there's like a fascination to the idea of people and the conversations that you have with them and the influence that's possible. So I keep like thinking of you in more and more places of where we need to get your insight in this industry. So thanks for joining us today
Yeah,
here.
it's fun to be here.
Yeah. I want to introduce it to you to everyone, too, just like what you've done and how you've
Sure.
kind of been in and out of this industry. Um, you focus on influence.
I
That's the
do.
big term you use. And I like to point out when I say that it's not like influencer, like
Right.
the Kardashians. It's more like the
No
classical
thanks.
Dale Carnegie influence, like how to influence and
Hmm.
influence people kind of influence. Um, and more brands and agencies or whatever are asking you to consult with them because it's becoming a bigger and bigger piece of the pie. So give us a little bit of your background of why you know what you know and kind of what you do with that.
Sure, sure. So I grew up on the agency side about 25 years in independent agencies, larger ones. Fleishman Hillard before they were bought by Omnicom, and then an agency called Wagner Edstrom that is now We Worldwide. Before I went in house and then out on my own. And the the sort of core area of focus was around communication strategy, and I like to call it in terms of like integrated marketing communications. It was we talked a lot about how we operated at this intersection of paid, earned, and owned for our clients, both at Fleischman and particularly at We, and through that one of the things that became really clear to me and I became very passionate about, I joke that actually in my if I were to do it all over again, I might be a neuroscientist because it's like super
Yeah, right.
fascinating the way the brain works, right? and how you get people to do that. One of the things that I really have always believed is the power in a story well told to really inspire an action and an outcome that you're looking for. And to do that, you have to really think about influence, and you have to think about it in its broadest sense. So at an agency, you have to really think about, how am I going to help my client see the opportunity in front of them to do the right thing to advance the goals for their business. Not always easy for them to see that because they're so busy in the day to day. When you're in-house, you have to think about, how am I going to help my peers see the opportunity, and or make sure they think about the cost if they don't engage me, right, in the right ways to the business or the outcomes. And so it really comes down to this idea of, how do you think about how you do the work in a way that makes you most effective at getting the right work done? And so that became sort of a passion point for me.
Yeah. Well, what I was thinking is, like, whenever I hear you kind of explain it, the first place my brain goes is like big picture thinking. So you're saying like the why someone's doing something, the how they're doing it, and so on. It always feels like I'm just, say at the worst, I'm a vendor. I'm supposed to just execute what they told me to do. And I want to know more or understand more to it. So that big picture thinking. But I feel like what I've learned from you is like, Tim, it's not just the big picture, it's actually the detailed part of that big picture, because you're going to play a role in that. And I think that's where most of us stop, is like, we could see this big picture desire or big picture problem, but we actually don't know the details of like what questions to ask or how to get in there. Or as we said in the title here, how to directly connect ourselves to that client or to their problems.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You get real wrapped up in like, I see the opportunity. Why don't you see it with me?
Yeah.
And you have to really think about how are you engaging with the client in a way that breaks it down and makes it so they can see it too.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, they've hired you because they like that big idea thinking. They like that big picture thinking. They like how you're shown up, but they've also hired you because they don't know what to do about it.
Right. Well, at least we're hoping that they're leveraging our expertise, right? That's some of us in the conversation we're having with them.
That's right.
I don't think it's about being a strategist either. Sometimes you need to shut up and give them the space to actually let them give it to you. Because I think like a lot of people have got those answers bound up in there. And sometimes we go in these conversations being so clever, we think we've got to outsmart them. But, listening, and we were talking a little bit about empathy before as well, creating that space so they can actually drop it on you.
Yeah, I think, I talk about how influence happens at the intersection of curiosity, listening, and leadership.
Say that again. Because what is the intersection?
Influence happens at the intersection of curiosity, listening, and and leadership. Because when you're doing all of that, right, then you're actually in the present with them. And it's a cycle, right? If I'm curious, tell me more about that. I'm hearing you worried. I'm hearing you raise some concerns. I'm sensing some concern. Tell me more. Or what about what we presented was so exciting to you? Like what made you hire us, right? What about that? Like, get curious, but then really stop and listen. Right. And by listening, you got to do real active listening, almost to the point of like checking for understanding, which people say to me when I talk about this, it can feel very like paternal or maternal, right? Like, because you kind of patronizing to some degree, because you can do like, did I hear you right when? And so it's thinking about, how am I showing up in a way that like I'm checking for understanding? Like, am I understanding right? Like, Matt, when you talked about this, what I heard you say was this. Does that feel like, was I on the right track when I said, oh, you got to check for understanding? That's when you're really actively listening. And then you get to lead them, right? Then there's some leadership that happens that talks about, okay, well, the things that I see, that's where your big picture thinking ends up coming in, right? And that's when influence starts to happen, because you're showing them that full circle from you.
I feel like most of the people I work with, when I ask them to lean into their curiosity muscle and talking to a client, which means, by the way, ask questions, right? That's how curiosity comes out. They are somewhat hesitant to ask the questions because they feel like they're showing their card or putting themselves out there, admitting they don't know anything. If I have to ask you a question, I don't know the answer. I am admitting I don't know something, and that gives me like a feeling of weakness. From what you're saying is like, no, not at all. Like asking those questions is the beginning of engagement.
It is the beginning of engagement. I mean, oftentimes one of the things that I counsel and coach people on is the first time you're sitting with the client, you've won the business, you're sitting there with the client. I would start to talk about like, how do you like to work? Because let me tell you a little bit about how we like to work. We like to ask a lot of questions. And it's not because we're questioning you. It's not because we're doubting you. It's not because we're not clear. It's because that's where we get inspiration and that's where we get clarity. And so I'll just tell people like, put it on the table, put it out there at the very beginning, deflate any kind of preconceived notion around what the kinds of questions are, right? And what's motivating the questions. And then
Isn't
the other
it also
thing is,
like, yeah, you go ahead.
no,
I think you were going to say it.
no, I was going to say the other thing is like, and get to a place where you're super comfortable with like, what are your 3 go-to questions, right? That you then become really comfortable with like, I'm always going to ask this question because I know that's going to lead to the next, right? Or I know that's a place where I can show up with credibility and authority that when I ask a question like that, I can show up in a way with confidence that it's going to then lead to a better conversation in the next set of questions.
Yeah, those go-to questions are so great. If almost everyone on this call has sat in a room with me. So if I told you my go-to questions, I might be giving up my secret. So I'm not going to tell you what it is. But I think those go-to questions give me so much actual information that people might not even realize I asked them one of my go-to questions because it just created a overflow of information and it inspired a bigger conversation. And I've become really comfortable with us just asking it. Like it's just something that feels natural. And I found that way. But to know that, to understand like that's one of the things you're looking for and to know and own that is really, really huge.
Melissa,
Okay, Matt.
What's one go-to question that isn't one of Tim's questions, but that you don't think people ask enough? Like, is there one question that you feel like people are just leaving it on the table by not asking it, or that you constantly go, why didn't you ask that?
The one that always surprises people that I really like is saying, if you were your number one competitor, what would you be doing? Because people don't think about it that way. They just think about what they want to go do and why they're doing what they're doing, right? When you're in there, it's like, okay, so if you were your number one competitor, one, get them to name who that is, right? That's always interesting. Yeah. And two, because it brings that to the table. It gets them to think like, oh, if I were going to try and deposition myself, right? If I was a competitor, and that creates a really interesting dialogue that you wouldn't normally have. So that's been one that I've added into my first 3.
By the way I would Timize that question and answer the question so you don't realize it's a question is I'd say something like, well, I've been thinking about who your competitors would be. And then what motivates those competitors? So for example, who's one of your first competitors? Who's one of your biggest competitors? So I kind of set up a somewhat of a curiosity first, and then I asked it. And I think if you just jump into that like weird textbook question without like giving it your own personality and context, it looks like you're reading a script. And you have to be comfortable with what you're looking for from the answer so you can find your own words to getting there. Because I think many of us, it's awkward when someone goes like, oh, that's one of those questions from the book. But I can ask similar questions in my own way, and it turns into like a dialogue that you're looking for. So like find your own personality exactly doing that.
Horton's just raised in the chat, a client said that they should have emailed their questions through beforehand and that a Zoom wasn't necessary. What would you say to that?
I'm good, thank you.
I was going to say, give me more context. So it was like a first meeting with the client, and you asked some questions, and the client said you should have just emailed me.
No, we typically would send out like a creative questionnaire beforehand, just to understand the project. we get on the call and everything went well, but then when we requested a follow-up call to ask
Right.
more questions, they seem yeah, okay, we got on the call, but afterwards, the feedback we got was like, yeah, we didn't need that call. You could have just emailed us.
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I
So,
think that goes back. Go ahead.
oh no, I was just thinking like, so in other words, the client leaned into it thinking it was more than just a regular Q&A situation. Sounds like, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I would say part of it is our fault, right? Like we should have outlined for a new client in this case of how we work and how we would proceed. I think they did not have the context, and they came in thinking that we should have been like that other vendor who just didn't
Mhm.
get on and ask questions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that would be my feedback and sort of thoughts around it is the whole sense of, as you're engaging with a brand new client in particular, you got to spend some time really talking about how do you like to work, right? How do we like to work? How do we normally work? How do you like to work? And I found, honestly, sometimes when I've done it, right, they're kind of like, I'm done with the housekeeping. Can we just get going? And so you kind of have to say like, hey, we're really eager to get to work, and we know that to work really well together, we've got to do a little bit of housekeeping to figure out sort of how are we going to get up and running together in a way that gets us sort of off to the races.
Yeah, I'll come back to the title that we chose for today too. I think, and this comes directly from you, Melissa. It's the idea of like connecting. So
Mm-hmm.
our questions, our curiosities, therefore our questions are not as much about just getting transactional data from someone.
Correct.
It's in a relational way. So the question that you're asking about who's your biggest competitor is somewhat asking of like, where do you see yourself? How do you understand yourself? How do you present yourself? And you're asking it in a simple way. But I need to know that because I need to understand who you are and what you're about. Because
Mm-hmm.
I want to understand who you are specifically, but eventually how we're going to get there or why you're thinking about this as a project or a piece to the pie. So
That's
if
exactly
I'm going
right.
to be an active participant in here and I would do stuff, it's really the idea of connecting, not just communicating through questions, but connecting with people. What's our hang up there then? Like, so give us some like bullet points of like, how do we actually connect? What are the visible signs or audible signs or whatever that would be where I know I'm hitting that or not?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of things to think about. One thing that I've spent some time talking about with agencies lately is when you win a new piece of business, there's a tendency to think, okay, we have a relationship. When in fact, when you win a new piece of business, it's like you've earned the right to have a first date, right? You're on this first date together, and when you think about it from that standpoint, it's like, okay, so now we have to go build a relationship. So what are the things we need to do to build the relationship from here, right? We get to pick up, they're picking up the check technically, but what are the things how do I get to know who these people are as humans, right? We connect to people on a human to human basis. Yeah, very apt, right? So like you got to connect with people on a human to human basis. And so you've got to think about who are they and why are they in the roles that they're in, right? And so you can tell when you meet people, we're all in client service, right? You can tell when someone's feeling comfortable sharing a little bit more about themselves than not, right? And it's always disarming when you start sharing about yourself first, right? And so one of the things that I think about is when, in terms of sort of what are the go-to things to start building is like, I know I was really excited about the opportunity to work with you because of the following. Like make it about you, make it about them, give them some insight into you, right? There's the whole premise that like you've got to give 3 times before you're going to get anything. So think about what are the 3 gives that you're going to give them about yourself, about the agency, about what you're about to do, about why you're there, that shows out some branch that says, I'm interested in a relationship with you. I'm not interested in just doing the work that you hired me to do. I'm interested in building a relationship such that together we can celebrate some success.
yeah, and like permission granted to be relational with somebody. You don't,
Correct.
I know that it's somewhat transactional because it's work, and it has like it's not as frequent or it's not as deep as like, a personal relationship, but relational understanding and communication is just as easy permitted. For some reason, we clamp up and we play a totally different role when we walk into a business meeting than we would in any other situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been finding a lot of clients are quite risk averse right now. There's a lot of tension about what do I do, and people are marketers have a lot of indecision. How would you say some of these, how can we get past that as we're trying to connect with people, or what should we be aware of when it comes to people's risk aversion?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we were talking about that before we got on with everybody, right? I think we are living in a really interesting time right now where people aren't sure what to say, how to say it, right? Where to show up in a way that's the right way to do it. And I think part of that is, you've got to be able to be willing to say, what would worry you about this campaign? Right?
Oh, right.
So we're super excited. We're all feeling really good about it. Let's just take a time out and just make sure, is there any reservations? Is there anything in the environment that you're worried about? We're seeing this happening, we're seeing that happen. And it's about sort of taking a pause and going back up to the big picture and giving permission to say, you know what, I am really worried, right? Like the environment we're operating in is very strange, right? So how do I know that I'm doing the right thing? The other thing that I've done before, Matt, is you give them, and again, you got to sort of know who it is, but sometimes data is what really helps, right? I saw some research that indicates this, when we do this helps, right? And so the good news is it's validating. How are you validating for them that the approach you're taking is the right approach? Sometimes it's data driven. Sometimes it's like, competitor wise, or sometimes it's, another example or, a case study, in an apples to apples like situation, but not necessarily, direct competitor. But you have to really think about what is the evidence that sort of helps make it safe that what you're doing is the right thing to do.
And how do I deal with like hesitation from a client to either give me that information or open up to that kind of situation? Are there kind of tricks or simple things we can do with hesitation?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is, if someone's hesitating, it will either surprise you because it's the first time, right, that you've seen them do that. And so you can say, I'm noticing something that I don't think we've tackled before, right? I'm noticing a sense of concern and reservation as we're talking about this. Am I noticing that? Like, it goes back to that active listening. Like, am I reading this wrong? And if so, can we pause and just talk about that? There's a framework that we've talked about before, Tim, that we talk about: join, pace, and challenge. And when you think about it,
that's what my clue was to have you bring that up, by the way.
Right. And so in this whole idea around, in the very beginning on a project and a new relationship, you've got to start to a place of like joining. Are you on the same page? Do you and I agree that the goal of what we're about to go do is as follows? Do you and I agree that why we're doing what we're doing is the right thing? How are we feeling about that? Like, are we literally on the same team doing the same work? And then the concept of pace is like, once you realize, okay, so we're all joined, we're clear on the goal, we're clear on who's doing what, we're clear on the timeline, we're clear on why we're doing it. Okay, so then you start to sort of work alongside each other. And if you've done the joining at the beginning and you're clear on what the path looks like, then if you get to a moment or a milestone in the path that you're not sure if we're all still together or not, that's where you get to say, like, I'm curious. I felt like it was Tim's milestone that we were mapping to, but now we're mapping to Matt. So did we do a change? Is there a change in our plan? Do we need to pause and regroup? Like, how are you constantly sort of pacing and making sure we're all together? And there's an element of like, if you've joined and you're pacing together, yep, like we're clicking things through, Tim hit his milestones, Matt hit his milestones, things are feeling really good. That's then permission to say, did anybody just notice that the competitor just did the following, or the news cycle just did the following, or there's a storm coming and it's going to shut down everybody's power. So the whole idea of an ad going live on the day that people probably have no power is a bad idea. Like whatever it is, right? That's where you've been given permission to say, is anybody else worried about X? I feel concerned about Y. And that's sort of this idea of challenge. And the interesting piece about that framework is when you do this join, pace, challenge, if you've challenged and you sense some defensiveness, then you've missed a beat and you've actually not been working together. So then you've got to start back over and start at the join. Like, okay, I read it wrong, right? Okay, I'm so sorry. Like I felt like we aren't, can we just check? Are we still aligned that this is the goal and that this is the path that we're getting to? And these are the roles and responsibilities. Okay, if we are, then like, let's talk about what's next, right? So you kind of sort of, it's this circle.
Yeah. Hung and Ed are having a great chat in the sidebar about, well, it's following what you're talking about getting people to talk about what success looks like. So if you are on a call and you can find out what's the creative director thinking, what's the producer thinking, it might all be part of the same brief, but it's good to know the creative director wants to win a Cannes Lion and the producer wants to do something different, and make sure you tick those boxes.
Yeah, what's the end game?
Melissa, out of all the stressful client meetings I've been part of, probably the most stressful place I've ever put myself into was actually running a youth group. Because if you want to be challenged your personality, show yourself up to a bunch of 13 to 18-year-olds and then try to figure out who you are in that field, because they are very judgmental very fast, right? So the terms that we would use in that situation, we would say the word come alongside, like you actually have to come alongside them and then earn the right to be heard. And your join pace challenge has very similar, because the goal with working with youth is to challenge them, have them grow up and stay out of trouble and that kind of stuff. But you can't just jump in. It sounds too judgmental. So you have to earn the right to be heard, listen to them first, whatever, and then come alongside them, go at their pace, let them know that you're on pace with them. And then because they trust you, now you get there. Our client relationships are very, very equal to that, or any personal relationship. We're talking about client today, but this can be team members as well.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was talking about the other day with a gal that I worked with when we led the Microsoft account when I was at and we were talking about how there were two kinds of clients that we would work with, and there was one that would very clearly trust until they couldn't. Right? Trust until you did something that made them upset, whatever. And then it was like, oh, now we got to actually literally make a change in the agency staffing because that person went left when the client was going right, and the client is now done with that person, right? And so you have to really think about how you do that. Or there's the people that you work with that you're like, I've got to really earn their trust out of the gate. And so then you have to really think about, how am I going to earn their trust, to the point that you were just saying, like, what does that look like? And that's where that join pace challenge framework is really helpful when you're thinking about working with clients, is this idea of like, I'm going to go in it and make sure that as I'm servicing this new client, or if I'm servicing a client that I've had for a really long time, that I all of a sudden have a new player, right? A new person in the mix, right? A new creative, a new creative director, a new producer, a new client manager, right? That's going to come in. It's like, they may or may not have the same ideas. And so we've got to pause and figure out sort of how are we engaging in a way where we know that we're going to get in there and be able to have the influence we need to drive the outcomes.
And this is a universal human experience. This is, everybody needs this in almost every situation. So I would almost really encourage people to practice on your internal team. 100%. Understand that you're doing the join pace challenge with your friends and family, your closest people to you, so that when you get out there and talking about more, especially if you're trying to move your client from one area of business to another, or have yourself be seen differently in those experiences, you have to practice a little bit. That join pace challenge, as natural as it is, because we're all living it, it actually doesn't come out as natural as you want to, especially when we're painted in a corner. We just blurt stuff out. And that often just breaks the tie. And unfortunately, it resets you back to the join instead of keep you where you were in the pace. So it really
Well,
is something kind of fun
that's
to
right.
recognize and put yourself out the place.
And to your point, if you're just starting to do it, right, with people that you've been working with for a while, and you don't say, I'm going to try something new, right? I've learned this. I want to try a different approach here. I'm going to ask a lot of questions, or I may show up differently. People are going to be like, what are you doing? Who is this person that I thought I knew how to work with, right? So there's this element of like, slow down and make sure in the joining piece, as you're starting to really think about being conscious and direct about it, right?
Yeah.
Own it. Say, like, one of the things that I've been really noticing is that I think we need to spend more time making sure out of the gate we're all on the same page so that we can go real fast. And so you're going to see me slow us down in certain places to make sure that we stay together so that we can accelerate through to the outcomes.
I want to jump to anyone else's questions as we get there, but before we do, just because it's at 5:30 East Coast time or 2:30 us in the warm weather or weather states, I want to share what you and I have been working on for the last month or so. This Mastering of the Art Influence Accelerator that you and I are putting together. We haven't announced this yet. This is not an official announcement, but I just don't want to miss the opportunity for people to prepare themselves for it. What we're going to cover in the class is really these key items. Here are the foundations of influence. So those are those universal things we just talked about here. And then getting into this idea of like building trust and credibility, eventually crafting new messages, because that's what we really want to do. The reason why we'd want to be interested as a business owner is getting ourselves seen differently with our clients, with our employees, with possible merger situations, what that stuff is. Like this persuasive messaging is really understanding those arguments and presenting it, handling the resistance and objections. I asked you about that today too. And eventually getting into strategies that you can play itself out. You and I are focusing on this because we're dealing with a huge pivot in our industry. You've seen it with your clients. I'm seeing it with my clients. We're going to have to ask totally new questions. And in some cases, our clients might not even know those answers. So connecting with them so they'll let us go on the journey with them, it's going to be a really important piece of the puzzle that we're dealing with here. It's not business as usual. So we have to say things differently, relate differently, and connect differently. So the timing is like it's been kind of thrust upon us, hasn't it? It's like the moment is now. We have to start doing something different.
Yeah, I think the other piece on it that's really interesting is all that you said, and we're also in this place where, to Matt's point, people are feeling risk averse and therefore more inclined to be order takers than not. So, for example, a gal that I've worked with for a long time, she's having me come in to Nike to her team to really talk about how do we get comfortable thinking about influence in its broadest sense, because we can't just resort to being order takers at a time that things feel stressful, right? Everybody knows Nike's gone through all sorts of things, right? And so at a time where, that's a big company. It happens at small companies too, right? When there's change, when there's disruption, when you've lost a client, you've landed a new client. There's just this whole sense of like, how do we make sure that we're really thinking about influence in its broadest sense? That it's not just influencing the clients, it's influencing our people to show up in the right ways. So it's sort of a 360-degree view of that.
Yeah, and you're really establishing the foundation or the anchors for the conversation when you have good influence. You create those anchors and those foundations. That's right. And that allows us to grow and pivot from something. Today, I feel like those anchors are moving. So we have to understand influence more than anchoring. So we have to know what we're looking for, but we have to be able to come alongside and work alongside that the entire time and not lose relevance to the conversations or relevance to the work we're doing. Anybody that's commoditized themselves will lose. They've anchored themselves here and everything shifts away. And that's why they're losing, is their anchor isn't moving with them. And that's so scary. It's so scary. But it's why we need to learn how to do this, or just know, I feel like just going into a class with other people doing it, it almost feels comfortable because we're all doing it together instead of thinking you're on a lonely journey just guessing. And luckily we get to leverage, you're a university professor, we get to leverage your years of experience and teaching knowledge we're going to learn in 5 weeks what you probably teach in a semester or a year. I don't know how long it actually takes to
Yeah,
do this
it's
stuff.
a
So
10 week.
this is
Yeah, the
master's
influence
degree
class I
level.
do. Yeah, the influence class I do at the University of Oregon is a 10-week class.
Yeah.
So it's pretty
And we're
fun.
doing in 5. This is a
We're
a
gonna
winter
crash course.
intensive. Yeah, exactly. But we won't lose. You'll always be around. Luckily, with influence,
That's
you
right.
form relationships with your teachers, and you can always go back to them.
Fact.
I want to open this up to anyone else's questions. I think Matt and I have our own curiosity, and as I said at the beginning, I think you and I can just keep on talking forever. But I would love to hear any other questions or thoughts, or like someone give us an issue that they can get some direct coaching from Melissa right now too. We'd love to kind of hear more and be part of this, bring you guys into this conversation more if you want to. I think while we're waiting for this too, the reason why you use the word influence, it's kind of anchored in the reality of what, like, you're just being truthful. I think a lot of people don't like the word influence because it sounds manipulative, but you're not talking about manipulation. And I think that's a key thing to kind of draw attention to.
Yeah, I mean, we've joked a little bit about it, you and I, right? It is authentic manipulation, right? But when you're doing influence well, it's because you've aligned on shared goals, right? And so that's where manipulation feels like I'm trying to get you to do something that you may or may not want to do. That's not what we're talking about here, right? But we've aligned on shared goals, and so you're trying to influence the direction to get there.
Hopefully, you're going to do something they do want to do. Like, I think you're talking about people not being brave right now. It's like
that's right.
It's like someone puts out a big brief. You're there to push them to be a brave marketer, a brave creative.
That's right. Give them the confidence jolt that they need.
Mm.
Yeah, and we'll find ourselves earlier in the conversation, not just at the moment of pitch trying to get someone to pick us, but we'll find ourselves sooner in the conversation reviewing the brief and understanding it, even picking it apart, maybe even changing it, right? That's going back to one of your original points. It's why our clients have hired us. We're in a different segment of the industry doing something different as an expertise. And it might look like they want something, but sometimes we need to correct them and give them a feedback on what we're seeing and what others are doing and what's working and not working.
That's exactly
to be able
right.
to step into those roles would be huge.
That's right.
Yeah, cool. Listen, I don't have to hold people on here if they don't want to. I just want to make sure that if you guys had any questions, just raise your hand or whatever. Because Melissa, you're giving us generously to 3 o'clock, but
sure, yeah.
Hang on. Yeah. I'll just say too, like the reason why I have kind of focused on this and why our friend connected the two of us, Melissa, is that in the branding space, the amount of indecision happening high up the ranks where decisions used to flow very easily. I'm trying to decode that and kind of find the missing pieces that used to be available. And to some degree, those might just have been spread out, some kind of diaspora of people being laid off. But in a lot of cases, it's the delegation of this down the food chain has screwed up some of these brands, and they almost don't trust that people downstream are doing their job or know how to do their job anymore. So there's a necessary regain of trust that needs to be put up sooner than later. And we have to understand that what's necessary and not just wait for our clients to do their homework and catch up. We can play a role in making that happen.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Hung's got a question.
Hung, what do you have? What's question?
So this is something maybe some of the studio owners could relate to. My background's creative, right? Not sales, not marketing. So I'm a classic introvert. I don't really, talking to Tim is exhausting. I'm kidding. No.
Yeah, exactly.
But it takes a lot out of me, to do this kind of stuff. And but I love the psychology of it, right? I read up on spheres of influence, about the difference between where you land in the middle between control and the other one is what concern, how do you land somewhere in between. I think that's the hardest part for me to navigate in terms of like, if you don't like, you're not an extrovert, you're not going to be talking to people in a natural way. It's really hard to nail that middle, right? That influence zone and not the control zone, because like creatives tend to control things. They want to control everything. Um, and then the insecurity of a creative is also to worry about the concern part, the broader things. So, landing in the middle is really hard, I
Yeah,
would
I mean,
say.
I think the piece there, one is that, right? So that's the first step, right? The first step is admitting where you're at, right? And so then I think the thing that I would talk with you about is think about what the triggers are when you start to feel yourself leaning towards control or leaning towards concern. And sort of what are the develop some strategies around, okay, I'm feeling this trigger on control. How do I sort of take a breath, figure out sort of, what should I really worry about in terms of control versus what am I going to influence and what am I going to accept, right? But you have to sort of pay attention to what the triggers are, because patterns are, they're patterns that will repeat themselves, right? When this starts to happen, I know I go into control mode. Or when this starts to happen, I know I go into concern mode. And so when you start to create awareness around what those triggers are, that's where you can start to really get yourself to think about what's my strategy to sort of like take a breath and reset.
Yeah, I'm not.
Is control is related to influence? Is it a different outcome than influence? Or is it a mistaken priority over influence? Like
I think it
control
might be a mistake.
sounds like
Yeah,
it's
I think it
influence
might
in
be
a
a
way.
mistaken priority over influence, right? Like control is an influence. Control is where you're gonna, sort of, I would call it sort of get the results, even if
Yeah.
there's roadkill, right? Because you've
Yeah, to,
decided that
to,
it's the right thing to do.
to me, control is when you take influence too far, you know? Like when you try to influence, but you want it your way and you want to make it happen your way, is when you take it
Mhm.
towards control. Concern is when you let go too much, because then you become insecure, you don't ask the right questions, and you end up being even more vague than when you came in with.
Mhm.
Melissa, I'm a big fan of Dr. Chantal Pratt in her book, like
Mhm.
Neuroscience of You, talk about
Mhm.
neural pathways and how you connect the
Yep.
ideas. That kind of stuff, fascinates me in how we do our work even. But that kind of stuff is I struggle all the time. Like, I'm watching for my triggers, but what are they? You have to kind of learn, almost like Matt did this in another workshop, Rekindle. It's like you have to kind of like develop a taste for it.
Yes, you do.
To me, it's in a way you have to develop a taste for influence.
Yeah. It's like a maturity factor, isn't it, Hung? Like you get this idea that overly concerned and I'll just say like an immature expression of influence feels like control because we don't know what else to do and we want to just hold on tight. Real influence allows you to let go and still know you're in a safe space that's safely working
Right.
alongside it. And that's where that come alongside kind of thinking or that pacing with somebody starts to prove it that you're not controlling them and they're not controlling you, but you can be in pace and work alongside them that way.
That's
But
exactly
that's
right.
where that practice is, meeting somebody. Yeah. Whenever you say that pace thing, most I always think of like when I was learning how to ski and my buddy was like the worst ski. By the way, thanks, Hung. I appreciate you. Um, my buddy was like the worst ski instructor because he'd basically go like, just follow me. And then he'd be like, and just take off. And like I was dangerously putting myself in a situation to keep up with it. It was total foolishness, right? So sometimes I think about like being in pace or come alongside somebody is like you have to know your limits and where you belong sometimes. I think when we do jump ahead, we can put ourselves in situations and crash and burn or whatever. So as we approach this idea of influence or finding clients and connecting with them, we really kind of need to know what our role is and what we can handle at the time and then earn our
Mhm.
right to be there. Because eventually in a few years, I can keep up with them,
That's
but I
right.
couldn't right away. So it's not like an immediate reaction, but it is a skilled thing. It's something when I did it enough, especially with my friends, I could get more and more into it. And they influenced me to get better and better and better and push myself till I can kind of be on par with them.
That's exactly right.
Skiing is deeply psychological.
I
You want to embrace
grew
failure.
up. I grew up with yeah. I grew up with a dad who would tell me that if I didn't fall, I wasn't trying hard enough. Wasn't
Yeah,
trying hard
right.
enough. Ski harder. Okay, Dad.
Yeah. What are you afraid of? Get out there.
What do you?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love this conversation. Thank you so much for jumping on here today. And I'm excited
Yeah,
to
super
kick off
fun.
our accelerator. I know we have to kind of like find our start point that we can
Yeah,
synchronize our schedules and get them done, but sooner than later, like we're gonna get
that's
this
right.
thing launched out there. And when we know it, we'll make sure we get an email and knows about it. I think one of the real reasons is I think that we actually have a desire for the next few years to keep up an understanding and have a core group of people that are kind of going through, we'll say like the ranks a little bit, and we're learning from what the work that they can do and come back to it, and
That's
have
right.
a few classes of people that are reaching out and making a change in our industry, because this industry is changing. And if we don't jump into the conversations, we're just going to be pulled alongside this thing.
That's
And there's
exactly right.
way too much talent and way too much knowledge to just let somebody kind of, for us to just be flying in the wind with somebody else. We can actually have an anchor. And your personal story does that. Like, you're sitting in the room with the leaders at Nike, starting with advertising as a core. Why is that? Well, because you've leaned into and took the effort to more and more understand what it's really like and why people make those decisions, and then how to get through those challenges.
It's pretty cool. Pretty fun. Like I said, I'll be a
Yeah,
neuroscientist in my next life. My next life, I'm going to be a neuroscientist.
me too. There's so much craziness going up here.
I
We
don't
have
know.
tell ourselves so many lies. I want to like get through all of those lies I have over there. Well, thank you again for this. I appreciate that. And all of you,
You
thank you
bet.
for kind of joining us today and being part of
Yeah,
the conversation. We appreciate that. Some of you, I'll see you in just 15 minutes over on the in the confab group that's doing this. And Melissa, I'm going to see you sooner or later as we kind of kick off this thing.
that's right.
So thanks again for joining us.
That's right. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Melissa.
Of course.
Thanks,
We'll see you
man.
guys next week.
See you,
Bye,
Dan.
everyone.
Bye.